Jonathan Turley, it seems to me that David Axelrod had a role in prepping her, the justice, for this occasion because she made a very strong commitment to the Founding Fathers, sounding almost like a strict constructionist or an original intention sort of person. What did you make of her genuflection to the Founding Fathers and the genius of our founding documents?
Well, I think that that's a fairly standard line. You really have to do that. You're not going to have a nominee stand up and say, the first thing I do is get rid of the Founding Fathers. But I do think that there is a problem here when we talk about temperament and empathy. You know, we're not selecting a house pet. I mean, we're selecting a Supreme Court justice. And as an academic, I have a certain bias. And that is, does she have the intellectual throw weight to make a difference on the court? And I have to tell you, the optics are better than the opinions in this case. I've read a couple dozen of her opinions. They don't speak well to her being a nominee on the Supreme Court. She will be historic in many ways, like Thurgood Marshall. But I'll remind you, Thurgood Marshall was not a lasting intellectual force on the court. He was historic because he was first. And I think that a lot of academics are a little bit disappointed. I am, in the sense that Diane Wood, Harold Coe were not the ultimate people to prevail. These are people that are blazingly brilliant. They would have brought to the court intellects that would frame it in a conceptual way.
Professor, can you imagine making that case in open hearings against a person who was summa cum laude at Princeton and who was editor at the Yale Law Review to come out and say they don't have the intellectual candle power? A minority woman especially? That's a tough case to make.
No, you're right, Chris. It's very hard. It's very subjective. And frankly, a lot of academics are going to be timid because they don't want to be viewed as opposing her. But you will see some focus on the opinions. I mean, the Rickey firefighter case, there's a case called Grant involves discrimination, which are likely to cause controversy. But what we saw with the Bork nomination is that the party that controls the first 48 hours in these controversies tends to prevail. And this is going to be the test of the GOP leadership. If they can't get hold of this in the next 48 hours, and I have to say this was a great start for the White House, they probably will not prevail.
Jonathan Turley has been watching today's developments along with us. He's also written about Sonia Sotomayor. He's a constitutional law professor at George Washington University School of Law. Jonathan, you wrote recently that my main concern is the lack of intellectual depth in her past opinions. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, I've read roughly about 30 of these opinions. She has a much larger library of opinions. But they are notable in one thing, and that it's a lack of depth. There's nothing particularly profound in her past decisions. She's been a judge a long time. That's opposed to people like Judge Wood on the Seventh Circuit, and she was viewed as a real intellectual powerhouse. You really can't read the opinions of this nominee and say, oh yeah, this person is a natural choice for the Supreme Court. Now, there have been surprises. You know, some justices sort of reached their speed and depth while on the court. Justice John Paul Stevens is an example. You know, even the first half of his career and decisions on the court were not particularly deep or profound, but the second half is quite the opposite. So you can have people who open up on the court, and as lower court judges, they may be timid in that respect. But I have to say that liberals obviously are enjoying, rightfully, a certain short-term elation with this twofer, a woman and a Latina, being put on the court. But in terms of long-term satisfaction, she does not naturally suggest that she's going to be the equal of Scalia. And I think that was the model for liberals. They wanted someone who would shape the intellectual foundations of the court. Her past opinions do not suggest that she is like that. It suggests that she'll be a great justice like Thurgood Marshall. She'll be the first Latina. But I'll remind you, Thurgood Marshall's opinions did not have a lasting intellectual impact on the court.
But even if there isn't a lasting intellectual impact that Sotomayor has of the court, and that's obviously a big if, isn't it quite possible that, that could come with the next pick or the one after that, and should that be much of a factor for anybody to consider?
I think it should be the factor, and unfortunately it's not. The Senate does not really look at the intellectual depth of a nominee. They don't seem to feel comfortable with that type of inquiry. That should be the primary inquiry. I mean, I do believe it's wonderful to have women on the court. I think Diane Wood would have met all criteria. But ultimately, questions about empathy and temperament are less important than whether this person is going to have a profound impact to help shape the court Court, and this nominee really doesn't have a history to suggest that.
So interesting. Jonathan Turley, professor of law. Jonathan, thanks for coming in. Good to talk to you, and we'll be talking with you, I'm sure, in the hours and weeks ahead.